a question?
Please do, yes.
Uh, One could make an argument that the Israelis and the Americans will not attack for two reasons that you did not mention. One is that Iran really pounded the Israelis the last time. The Israelis basically ran out of or were running out of air defense systems, and there are limits to what the United States has for purposes of helping them. Furthermore, the Iranians learned as the ballistic missile campaign slash cruise missile campaign went on. They got much smarter. All militaries go through a learning process when they get into a war, and the Iranians are no exception. So by the end, they were pretty sophisticated at finding the holes in the Israeli air defenses and getting the missiles through. The next time, with all that experience and all those missiles they have, they're going to really pound Israel. And Israel is a small country. The idea that Israel is going to pound Iran and get off scot-free, that's not going to happen. So that's point one. Point two is a lot of people say that one of the reasons the Americans shut the war down after 12 days was they had an inkling that the Iranians were going to shut down the Gulf, the Straits of Hormuz, and the economic consequences of that, especially given the state of the international economy, would have been disastrous, is probably not too strong a word. So if I were the Iranians, I'd say to both the Americans and the Israelis, you want to play hardball, okay, but you want to understand I'm going to play hardball too. And we're going to do everything we can to pound Israel, number one. And number two, we're going to shut down the Straits of Hormuz and do great damage to the international economy. The idea that you're going to wreck the Iranian economy and pay no price, forget that. We're going to make everybody pay. So you better not attack. It would just seem to me, Trita, I mean, if I had to bet, I'd bet you're right that the Israelis and the Americans, but mainly the Israelis will attack. But I think there is a quite powerful case against that. And I'm just curious what you think.
Oh, John, I completely agree with you. I think there's a very powerful case, particularly from an American national interest standpoint, that this is absolutely foolish. I mean, you mentioned that the Israelis were running out of Arrow 3 interceptors. The United States consumed 25% of its THAAD interceptors over the course of 12 days in a region that three administrations in a row have said is no longer vital to U.S. interest. So clearly, from a standpoint of the United States, yes, I agree with you 100%. It doesn't make any sense. Now, from the Israeli standpoint, everything you said in your first part of the question, all of the abilities of the Iranians to strike Israel, and let me just give a couple of examples of it. We saw how, exactly as you said, over the course of the war, the Iranians actually started shooting less and less missiles. And the public narrative was, oh, the Iranians are taking huge hits, the Israelis are taking out their launchers, etc. And to a certain extent, that was true. The Iranians were taking hits, some of the launchers were taken out. But the real story is that they were getting through more and more missiles. If I'm not mistaken, on the last day, they only shot 30 missiles, 19 of them got through.
Yeah.
And they were also getting much better at using cyber warfare at the exact moments that the missiles either were being launched or when they were reaching Israel, because you only needed to get the Israeli systems off for 2 or 3 seconds in order to make sure that you created those gaps. So without a doubt, they learned quite a lot. But this is precisely why the Israelis are going to attack rather than the opposite. Israel does not tolerate that there is any country in the region that actually has the ability to deter Israel, that is infringing on what they believe is the necessity of their complete maneuverability in the region. I mean, the Israelis have a security doctrine in which they have to have total security. And as a result, everyone else have to have total insecurity. So when you have any state like Iran that have shown its ability to be able to hurt Israel, that is all the more reason for the Israelis to go in and try to make sure that they take it out. Now, of course, you're right. It's going to be much more costly than what they thought. They needed that ceasefire because they were taking more and more hits. And they particularly needed the ceasefire because it became clear that the US was no longer going to be in the war. Had Trump decided to be fully engaged in the war, I think the Israelis would have accepted taking and absorbing even more hits as long as they knew that America's firepower was also a factor in the war and that was really taking out a lot of what the Iranians have. But since Trump decided not to do so, I think the cost benefit analysis for the Israelis changed. But if you're sitting in Israel with their calculations, the fact that there is a state that has that capability, I think makes it all the more unacceptable for them, given the fact that they want to have that complete dominance. Now, as to your second question, you're absolutely right. There were indications that the Iranians were going to try to shut it down. When the US was modeling this 20 or so years ago, it was all about how the Iranians would be using mines, etc. Today, it's very different. The Houthis closed down the Red Sea essentially by just firing missiles. They don't even have to hit the ships. They just need to fire the missiles. It's enough to make sure that no one wants to go through the straits, that the insurance cost becomes prohibitive. So the Iranians clearly have that ability to do so, and it would be devastating for the world economy. But it would probably also cost a lot for Iran with its relations with Russia and particularly with China. So this is not an option that I think the Iranians easily will go towards because it will be costly for them as well. But it is something that the US absolutely should take into account. And I think the mistake that the Trump administration has committed, and I think Trump himself essentially believed that he stopped the war by taking this action. And to a certain extent, on a tactical level, he has a point. But I think it would nevertheless would have been better if he never given a green light to the Israelis in the first place. Because by allowing that to happen, he's now increasingly in a situation in which the Israelis determine much more of the factors that are going into his decision making, and they're essentially shaping his options for him to their liking than otherwise would have been the case. He has to have a much starker break with them in order to be able to retain that agency that he had prior to giving the Israelis this green light.
But Trita, I mean, the 12-day war between Iran and Israel, that stopped because the US shut it down, right? And so if there was so much reluctance then, the loss of their THAAD interceptors, all of that, I mean, why would the US now agree to a much more prolonged war against Iran?
I think we have to be a bit careful. I mean, John and I are both realists. He's much more of a pure realist than I am, probably. And it's at the basis of it that states are rational actors. And I think living in Washington, it's very, very difficult to fully reconcile with that element of realism. I don't see that being, if this was the case, we wouldn't have gone into this war in the first place. And we saw that Trump was moving in a different direction. Something happened in May. He completely shifted. And there is, of course, a fear that because of a variety of political pressures, etc., this once again will be the case. Let me also throw in another factor. Precisely because the Iranians know that the Israeli objective is to subjugate Iran into complete Israeli domination and turn it into the next Lebanon or Syria. The Iranians are likely to strike much harder and faster in the early stages of the next war than they did in the first 12-day war. The Iranians were actually playing the long game. They were hoarding a lot of their missiles, not knowing how long this war was going to be, and they wanted to see if they could have the advantage of being able to tolerate the war longer than the Israeli public would. Now, I think in the next round, they're going to try to strike Israel as hard as possible, as early as possible, to dispel the Israelis from any notion that Iran can be turned into the next Syria or Lebanon. That likely means high casualty events inside of Israel. And that is going to massively increase the pressure on the United States to get involved in the war, even though it makes no strategic sense for the US to do so.
I think, though, what you're saying, Trita, is that both the United States and Israel will behave irrationally because the story you're telling, right, is that it doesn't make sense for either Israel or the United States to start this war. And that was the point that I was trying to get at. This just doesn't make good strategic sense. What's the target set this time if they attack Iran again? They hit the nuclear sites the first time. You remember on June 22nd, Trump struck against Iran, but you can't have another one-off attack like that because those targets have purportedly been destroyed. So what is the American going to do? Americans going to do? Get into a strategic bombing campaign against Iran over the long term that threatens Iran's survival and puts Iran in a position where it's desperate and therefore it does shut down the straits and therefore it does turn the dogs loose on Israel? It just kind of doesn't make sense. But again, I agree with you, they'll do it. But I think what we're saying here, I mean, I think if you look at a lot of what Israel has been doing, it does not make strategic sense. The Israelis basically take their six-shooter out every day and blow each foot off. It's really quite remarkable how foolish, from a strategic point of view, their behavior is. And I think that
John,
dovetails with your argument as to why they'll do it.
yeah, John, I agree with you. I find this to be foolish. Let me add something to what you said, but also try to see if I can explain a little bit how I think that they view the situation. At the end of the day, going back to what you yourself said earlier on in this conversation, the Israelis want to make sure that they turn Iran into six smaller countries, collapse the regime, that they keep all of their neighbors weak, etc. Well, that objective requires a war that will be costly to Israel, but precisely because the Iranians may go after the Strait of Hormuz, that is how you get the United States into the war. And what the United States can do in terms of cutting Iran down in size compared to what the Israelis can do, the question is, the answer is obvious. The US can do so much more. If that then means that it will cost Israel a lot in terms of taking a lot of hits, etc., that currently seems to be something that the Israelis are willing to accept. I mean, just take a look at the manner in which they're even embracing the international isolation that they are now subjected to. Israel is on a straight path towards permanent pariahhood because of its conduct, because of this genocide. And it's shocking, mindful of the fact that for such a long time, the Israelis were pointing to their political and economic integration into the world as a sign of their success. They had been accepted. Despite the fact that the Palestinian conflict had not been resolved, they had been accepted. Now, instead, as all of the delegations more or less walk out of the General Assembly when Netanyahu is speaking, when they're risking to be kicked out of the World Cup and the music Eurovision festival in Europe, instead, Netanyahu comes out and says that Israel is going to be super Sparta. The absolute opposite of what he had sought earlier on. Instead of embracing integration and acceptance, they're now embracing pariahhood.
But I want to point out, Trita, that you said before, quite correctly, that the Israelis, when they bombed Iran, drove the population and the government closer together. Nationalism, patriotism came into play. And as you well know, the historical record on this issue is clear cut. Anytime you bomb a country and you start killing people, the people come together and the people in the government come together. So if you're telling me that the Israelis are now committed to breaking Iran apart, and they're going to do that with air power by punishing the civilian population in Iran, that contradicts what happened the last time they bombed the civilian population. It contradicts everything we know from the historical record. And it guarantees that, if anything, at the end of that bombing campaign, Iran will be more cohesive than ever, and the Israelis will be farther away from their goal of breaking that country apart like Syria and Lebanon.
Again, I agree with you. I think what they're doing is foolish. It's a miscalculation. What I think they think is they didn't hit it hard enough. They did not manage to break down the command and control. They believe if they manage to destroy the state central control, they will get various provinces with high levels of ethnic minorities, some of them having sectarian or cessationist tendencies, to be able to find opportunities to be able to go in that direction, which probably will be combined with a funneling of weapons into those areas. So this is something the Iranians were very, very cautious about. They were constantly looking at the Kurdish region as well as the Azeri region, fearing that the Israelis would try to do something with their bombing campaign there to cause the central states lose control over those regions, and then it would have a centrifugal effect of things that they no longer could control. So I think the Israeli calculation is the reason why they failed is because they didn't bomb enough. because it didn't go far enough, and they're going to try it again. I think they're wrong, and I think you are absolutely right that nationalism is a force that is to really be reckoned with. Again, this is not a terribly popular regime, but at the end of the day, when they were attacked, it is not about the popularity of the regime or anything like that that mattered. It was the fact that there was a foreign enemy that was using diplomacy as a guise to actually attack. And I think this is part of the reason why the population's reaction ended up being so ferocious, because this happened 2 days before new scheduled talks, at a moment where the Iranian public clearly saw the Iranian government had gone further than ever before in showing openness for compromises, including compromises that it never agreed to with the Obama administration or the Biden administration in the JCPOA, such as welcoming American companies into the Iranian market. So at the moment when the Iranians were the most flexible in the midst of those talks, that's when the Israelis chose to strike.
Sure. I even don't want to ask any more questions because just the back and forth between you two is just incredibly informative. And so